So welcome back to all of you to our second part, which is actually the work of the directors of the WZB. So I'm only introducing a very, very small movie which you're going to see, 2 minutes. And this gives you some impression about the history of the WZB. It shows you the 4 presidents with some remarkable sentences on what the mission and the vision of the WZB is and what they consider to be the most important things while they were presidents. And then I give over to Macartan Humphreys.
Ein junger Kollege hat das mal die fette Katze genannt. Das WZB ist eine fette Katze. Und dafür muss man eigentlich was Besonderes leisten. Und können wir das nachweisen? An Publikationen oder an Kontakten, an Auslandsaufenthalten. Nicht nur von uns gesuchten und finanzierten, sondern eingeladene.
Problemorientierte Grundlagenforschung, das Adjektiv aber soll andeuten, dass dieses WZB schon dafür gegründet worden war und sich auch in dieser Rolle sah, sozialwissenschaftliche Forschung mit Bezug auf drängende Fragen der Zeit zu betreiben und dabei Dinge aufzunehmen, die um uns herum geschehen und in der Luft liegen und Wissen zu produzieren, das nützlich ist zur Lösung gegenwärtiger Probleme. So erklärt sich auch der permanente Wandel in dieser Institution, denn die Zeiten ändern sich.
Als wir die Grundsteinlegung feierte und der Forschungsminister lange darüber redete, wer alles unterstützt hat, dass das hier hinkommt, flüsterte mir Sterling zu, ich erinnere mich noch gut an die Zeit, als es auf der Welt nur 2 Leute gab, die dann glaubten, dass daraus was wird.
Ich habe bei meinen Kontakten mit der Praxis immer wieder Bewunderung gehabt für das, was der Praxis einfällt zu sich selber. Und das können wir stören mit Kritik und mit dem Aufweis davon, wie es ganz anders gehen könnte. Und das ist dann auch wichtig. Aber es umzusetzen, daraus Politik und tatsächlich Ökonomie zu machen, das ist nicht unsere Sache. Insofern heißt problemorientierte Grundlagenforschung auf der einen Seite Nähe zu den Problemen, die die Praxis bearbeitet, andererseits aber auch Halbdistanz zur Praxis, sich nicht vereinnahmen lassen.
Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Distinguished Speakers series for today. I was asked to say a word first about what it means to be a distinguished speaker, which is not entirely clear. It's not entirely written down. The dictionary has very successful, authoritative, and commanding great respect. There's also a second meaning, which is noble in appearance and manner. So I think we hit both of those. But maybe as part of the background, the way WZB works is it's a mid-sized institution in which groups work in quite small teams, internally cohesive, integrated teams working on many projects. And a lot of the seminars and meetings and discussions happen within this kind of framework. And every now and then, we come together for these broader, bigger discussions. And the Distinguished Speakers series plays a very central role in that, where the entire House comes together to listen to speakers who have made a big impact in the way we think about different areas. So the Distinguished Speakers are typically speakers or researchers who earlier this morning, the word role model was used, and I think this is an appropriate word here, that people who have often looked more widely, seen farther than other researchers we're encountering, and that are boundary busting, that alter the way we think about questions. And certainly that's true of the three speakers we have today. So I'm going to abuse the position of being first here to say just a short thing about all three speakers, which I'm not sure I'm meant to do. But first of all, Mansky's work had a big impression on me in the sense of, a question that Mansky asked, which I had not seen asked in the same way before, is when is a question answerable? Right? When, even if we have access to all the data in the world, is it even possible to get an answer to that question? And we often pursue questions that actually you can't answer. Right? And there was a negative answer in a way to this, sometimes you can't, but also a positive answer to this, that you can still learn, even in situations where you know you won't get the optimum sort of answer in a way. And that altered, for me, the way I think about research and what we're aiming for when we're engaging in research. It's a fairly deep effect. Margaret Levy has perhaps had the longest impact on me, because she's one of the few social scientists that actually read an undergraduate, and sort of maybe a week after learning about this rationality model that I found just fantastic, I read Margaret Levy, who was saying this actually full of holes and problems and so on. So the book Limits of Rationality had enormous impact on me. But later in my work, she was constantly asking questions that other people weren't asking, introducing into research topics such as legitimacy or trust or authority that were often seen as outside of the purview of political science research. And that altered the horizons of what the discipline meant to me. Jennifer Hochschild, who I'm introducing now, described herself in one text as a card-carrying political scientist. I'm not sure if you've used that more than once, but certainly I came across that. And I was sort of struck by it. She was the editor of the APSR, of the AGPS, of the JOP. These are all the major journals in political science. She also founded what is the primary journal for bridging between political science, academic research, and more policy, public-facing questions, perspectives, and politics. And she's also the president of the APSA. So she is establishment political science. On the other hand, she's also, alongside her position in government, she's also faculty of the Graduate School of Education. She's also in the faculty of the Kennedy School, which works in public administration, and is also very often holding chairs in American law. So you have this sense with her that she's obviously a major figure in the discipline, but she's not constrained in any way by the discipline. And the kinds of questions that she brings in draw on psychology, sociology, economics in an extraordinarily fluent way. As part of this, I had the pleasure of going back and looking at a large corpus of extraordinary work. One question, which is a very timely question, is why is it was touched on this in this morning's breakfast talks, but why is it that poorer voters aren't voting more for redistribution, aren't demanding more redistribution? It's a tremendously important, timely question. It's a question that Jennifer took on and combined both data about patterns, but also a set of interviews with poor white voters to address this question. I came up with a very compelling account of different motivations in terms of how people in different strata are understanding the situation and understanding their role in it. And it feels incredibly fresh. What's amazing about the work is, you know what I'm talking about. This is from 1979, so 40 years ago. So we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of this, but this work, in a way, what's extraordinary about it, it was followed by 30 or 40 years in which many political scientists were continuing not to recognize the basic fact that you were explaining in 79. So it's kind of extraordinary. But the set of ideas and themes that were in that work, you can see as a sort of bright line running through much later work. I don't want to monopolize too much time. I've got paragraphs and paragraphs on different parts of this. But in many cases, when I was looking at it, I was thinking, oh my gosh, she was doing that then? Because we thought this was something kind of new. So, so questions like, the challenges of migrant integration, which many of us are starting to work on here and seeing as tremendously important. Jennifer had been deep into that in around 2000, 2001. Work we're doing now on politics of local monitoring of service provision. Jennifer was publishing in 1981, 1982 on this work. She's been working on questions of basically fake news or the role of facts in politics for a long time. A wonderful book, Do Facts Matter? Figuring out not just the problem of people having misinformation, but distinguishing between those who have the wrong information that do act on it and those who have the right information and don't act on it, and trying to figure this as a larger puzzle. So I guess when, if you're smart, you look at this history and you say, well, what's she working on now? Because that's what we got to get moving on. And so right now she's working on genomics. And there's a big project which I think, maybe you can say more, but so far the discipline hasn't engaged with this topic, and she's pushing this very far forward. So hard to keep up with. But a thread throughout all of this work is a focus on these sorts of major structural features. So race, class, how they're interacting, how they interact to perpetuate inequalities, both economic inequalities, social inequalities, and a theme that she's been very prominent in drawing attention to is political inequalities also. And I'm expecting those will be themes of this work and looking forward to it very much. Jennifer Hochschild.
Thank you, that was lovely. Thank you. The problem with a beautiful introduction is that it seems impossible to live up to it. So thank you, Macartan. I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank the center. I'm thrilled to be here. It's impossible to follow Raj Chetty, and I'm very glad I'm preceding the other two speakers so that at least they have somebody else that they have to follow. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I really look forward to our conversation. This is a paper that I've been working on off and on for the last couple of years. Like many people in this room and several hundred million people in the United States, I was kind of knocked, headlong by the 2016 election. And I think I am no longer want to talk about the election itself. There's lots more to be said about it. But I want to talk about sort of what preceded the 2016 win by Donald Trump of the presidency, and what might be following as a consequence from it over a longer term. So try to put that kind of earth-shaking moment and the current presidency into a slightly longer perspective. And you'll see kind of the three big dimensions that I want to try to interweave as I think about that. It's not coincidence that I'm following Raj Chetty, in part because a lot of what I think about all of these issues comes from Raj's work, which is just extraordinary, as we all saw this morning. But my arguments are, so the themes and the issues and my thinking about it is largely influenced by him. But I actually think, as I was listening to him this morning and thinking about his work, our arguments are somewhat different from each other. They're not directly orthogonal, but they don't precisely coincide. So I'm really looking forward to the people thinking about how we link all these things together. So if I can pull all my stuff down. So I start with, as one often does, three quotations. The first is a reflection from the left about the 2016 presidential election. America died on November 8th, 2016, not with a bang or a whimper, but its own hand via electoral suicide and so on. So a very dramatic perspective on what happened as a consequence of a fairly normal, in a kind of conventional structural sense, presidential election. The second quotation is obviously equally apocalyptic. It comes from the right rather than from the left. This is by a conservative scholar at the Claremont Institute who's got a long essay in which this is sort of the primary point, which is that if we don't elect Donald Trump, if we don't transform the country away from the liberal elite path that it's been taking for the last 30 or 40 years, then we are headed off a cliff. So they both see the election as apocalyptic, but of course from opposite perspectives. And Donald Trump himself sees the election as apocalyptic. This is his inaugural speech about the American carnage, with, of course, President Obama sitting 3 feet behind him trying to look polite. So there's three questions I want to look at. The first is, Are these apocalyptic statements just way overblown? This is political rhetoric. This is, purple prose. We don't really take it all that seriously. So this is the first question. Is Trump's presidency, in fact, some variant of politics as usual, at least if we take a relatively long-term perspective? And one answer from my colleague, former colleague, but very eminent political scientist, Larry Bartels, is yeah, the election was, sound and fury signifying not all that much. It was an extraordinary campaign, Larry argues, but it produced a remarkably ordinary election outcome, reflecting partisan patterns familiar from previous election cycles. The outcome was consistent with forecasts based on fundamental factors like incumbency, the state of the economy. And if you look at the exit poll, the CNN exit poll, which is probably the most authoritative, basically Republicans voted for the Republican and Democrats voted for the Democrat. So, duh, right? I mean, we have a lot of Republicans, we have a lot of Democrats, and the country's more or less evenly split, and it goes marginally in one direction or the other. So this is kind of politics as usual, even though it was an unusual campaign. The second explanation of the not much going on, ratchet down the rhetoric, has more to do with the administration and management of government than with an election in particular. And this comes from Elaine Kamarck, a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School, who's a very long-standing, wise public administration, both scholar and practitioner. And she says, well, you actually can't, regardless of whether you want to try to drain the swamp, you can't. The Washington swamp is embedded in deep structural, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but you get the point. Every penny spent on a, quote, incompetent bureaucrat or a stupid program is spent according to a law that's been passed and that you, President Trump, would need to undo. This is written in the form of a letter to him. And this is a series of, I won't go through the list, but these are all the things that she describes as being part of the deep state, the Washington swamp, the incompetent bureaucracy, the red tape. These are actually laws, programs, judicial decisions, regulations, long-standing decisions that have their own internal logic, which one might or might not endorse, but is nonetheless pretty well fixed in law. So the idea that the president is going to come in and new broom sweeping clean, it's just not possible, she says. So relax, everybody. That's second version of the sound and fury signifying not much else. A third version of the sound and fury signifying not very much. This is a quote from Jane Mandridge, also my colleague, also with the Kennedy School, actually. She says, relax, populism is not such a bad thing. Most of us probably would prefer some variant of left populism to right populism, but nonetheless, populism as a political phenomenon is actually beneficial, or at least not dangerous to democracy. And her argument, again, shared by others, is that people like us, coastal elites, or urban elites, perhaps more generally across the Western European and the United States, is that we need to think harder about our own bubble, about our own lack of connection with what a majority of the population, or at least a large substantial segment of the American population, and perhaps British and elsewhere, the world that they live in is just different from the world that we live in. This is a set of questions that came from Charles Murray's recent book. He calls them the bubble questions, and it's about do you live in a bubble? Have you ever held a job that caused something to hurt at the end of the day? Well, probably many of us did in high school or college, but probably not much since then. Do you have a close friend who simply could not get grades better than a C even though they tried really, really hard? Have you ever bought a pickup truck? Have you participated in a 4th of July or an equivalent patriotic parade? Do you have a close friend who's an evangelical Christian? Do you have friends or family members who voted for President Trump or Boris Johnson or Bolsonaro, or again, or Oban or Erdogan or whatever? And the answer for me is, well, not actually very much. If I push really hard, I can think about a job I had in high school. So the bubble is a serious phenomenon. And so her argument is that a populist revolt intermittently is a good thing for democracy, to remind us that the rest of the country doesn't necessarily live the same way that we do. Okay, so that's the good news. The rest of the talk is about the potential, the bad news. But I have two buts. So the but is a response to the politics as usual, relax everybody, it's actually okay, things are not so bad and they can't be changed all that much anyway, and so it's okay. So I have two buts. The first has to do with democracy, a sort of democratic constitutional crisis. And it's cosmopolitanism versus localism. I'm not sure that those are exactly the right terms, but they're the ones I'm going to use for now. And this is, again, where I differ somewhat from Raj, who's focused on a much more granular level, sort of neighborhoods within a particular geographic unit like a city. And I'm at a somewhat more abstract or more aggregated level of analysis. And I'm not sure whether his data exactly map onto mine, but I'm going to go ahead with my argument because I'm not him. So here's the core of the political sciencey argument. A democracy, and this is kind of political science 101. It basically comes out of Robert Dahl, who was, of course, my teacher and mentor, and so much of what I think is sort of, whoops, no slide. It's sort of second or third generation Dahlism. Democracy needs a representation of many viewpoints. That's, in effect, what it means to have a representative democracy. But nonetheless, we have to figure out how to govern despite incorporating, engaging with difference, not shutting them out, but engaging with it. And to do that requires trust, which we're going to hear more about, I hope, connection, negotiation, management. But when we're in a circumstance in which opportunity, and I'm going to describe the circumstance over the next few minutes, and institutions, and political behaviors, and political views are all lining up on a single dimension, that's risky for democracy. And the empirical claim here is that cosmopolitan areas, roughly speaking large cities, predominantly but not uniquely coastal in the United States, are moving away from localist areas, by which I mean small towns, rural areas, relatively sparse suburban, not inner ring suburban areas. Literally, people are moving, and metaphorically. And the risk here, and this is the point that I'm going to get to, I'm going to circle back around to this central point, differences risk becoming a zero-sum game when you have an electoral system that's geographically based and in which cosmopolitan areas are moving away from local areas, and there's very little cross-cutting cleavage, very little unification allowable to create, or unification that will permit the kind of trust, connection, negotiation that you need. This is a political point at this point. It's not yet a constitutional failure, but the core conclusion that I'm going to come to is that at some point, the kind of political deadlock caused by geographically based electoral areas that are moving further and further away from each other can become, I don't believe it is yet, to give you my bottom line, but can become a constitutional crisis. So that's the democratic half of the argument that I want to make. I also have a liberal, as in the sense of rights, half, but I'm going to go through this half first. Okay, so there's a bunch of kinds of geographic divides that I want to argue are all lining up. You think about, a magnet on iron filings, right? I mean, that's the metaphor that we used to kind of be scattered, and we're now lining up along a single dimension. The first is a partisan divide. In 1992, 30% of voters lived in landslide counties. That was, I think, if I remember the definition of landslide counties, it's either 58 or 60% of the voters in that county voted for the same party. So roughly a third, not quite a third, of voters lived in counties like that. By 2016, close to 2/3 of voters lived in landslide counties, lived in counties in which the political configuration was a strong majority, one side or the other. Wasserman, who provided this data, says America's political fabric geographically is tearing apart. Here's a little bit of evidence around for the 2016 vote. And if you look, it's simply divided into urban, suburban, rural. Suburban is a bad category because it can mean both inner ring suburbs that look an awful lot like cities and outer ring suburbs that can look an awful lot like rural areas. So suburban is a kind of mishmash middle. It is, unfortunately, in these kinds of data, probably a majority of the voting population. So, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt or consider a continuum rather than a trichotomy or whatever. But the basic point here is if you compare the green to the red bars, close to, not quite, 1.5 times as many rural voters voted for Donald Trump as did urban voters, and correspondingly, twice as many urban voters voted for Hillary Clinton as voted for Donald Trump. So, in short, there's a kind of a geographic partisan separation. That's kind of dimension number one. Actually, one more version of the same argument. I think you can see the colors well enough. If you look at the country physically, it looks really, really different than it looks politically, of course, which is to say, the vast majority of the physical space of the United States is red here, but in fact, the Democrats won the House of Representatives through in this map. So again, there's a kind of a huge disparity between essentially place and population. Is another version of the same kind of claim about partisan split. Okay, a second dimension, mapping onto, and these are all kind of mutually causal in a way that I haven't really sorted out. I'm providing them as a list, but we'd want eventually to think about interactions. It has to do with the health divide. And so the public health scholar has done an index of public health, which includes life expectancy, obesity, diabetes, drinking, exercise in the United States counties. And that index explains about 40%, 2/5 of the excess or the increase in Republican support in 2016 as compared with 2012. So more, basically, the unhealthier the place, the more likely it was to vote for Trump is a variant on this kind of claim. Mortality rates, this is a much longer standing issue. This is not a 2016 issue. Mortality rates from substance abuse, this is largely what we call the opioid crisis, but it's broader and more complex than that, increased 1,000% in Appalachia and the lower Midwest in 1980 and 2014. And if you think back to Raj's maps from this morning, kind of a big red clump of the country, the southeast of the United States, but also a kind of a northeast to southwest bar through Appalachia was deep red. This is a part of the country where people in the bottom 25% are not upwardly mobile. Now, whether, again, what the exact cause and effect relationship is a little unclear, but there's a very serious health issue as well as everything else going on in our essentially rural or sparse suburban parts of the country. This is a variant on the same theme. What you want to focus on here is and again, I refer you back to Raj's work because he's done much, much more detailed and elegant work on life expectancy and its relation to economic and other kinds of standing. But here's a quick and dirty version of it. This has been ages 50 to 54. So it's white, non-Hispanic, high school graduate. So what we think of as the quintessential Trump voter. But again, I want to point out that this is a much longer standing and more complicated issue than just the 2016 election and its consequences. Life expectancy, since the 1930s, as far as I know, life expectancy has always grown, at least in the United States and in most Western countries, for just about every segment of the country. So the idea that mortality rates would increase rather than decrease, it's a really shocking phenomenon. Now again, this is a segment of the population, but mortality rates don't go up over a long period of time, and yet they are in this case. And the correlates of the age of death among the poor, it's roughly speaking the correlates of the age of death of the red line here are there's several things. Again, it goes back to the public health measures, smoking, obesity, no exercise. So people are physically somewhat unhealthy. And again, I'm channeling Chetty's work again, once again, Chetty and his co-author's work. But also, more importantly for my purposes, there's a series of collective or communal or community-based indicators that are associated with, at least correlated with, if not in a causal sense, what Case and Deaton called deaths of despair. Income segregation, income inequality, low social capital, unemployment, population decline, low labor force participation. So these people who live in poor and unsuccessful and despairing communities tend to die at a higher rate. So there's a health issue here. Here's a third dimension. So we have partisan, now health, now economic divide. And once again, there's big change over the last 20 or 30 years. Metropolitan areas compared with non-metropolitan areas in terms of inequality of income. There wasn't very much difference since they started being measured in 1980 until roughly the end of the 20th century, but a steep rise in comparative inequality since 1995. Another way of putting the same point, again, kind of cherry-picking little bits of data to kind of suggest what I'm talking about here, kind of economic mobility and engagement as compared with not. 1% of the counties in 2010-14 got 80% of the venture capital. These, of course, are all the cities. So the kind of economic dynamism is much greater in a very small number of areas than it is in the rest of the country. As a consequence, you get this kind of a graph. This is employment by the size of community, standardized on 2008, and this is the percent change in employment depending on the size of the community. So what you see is that the largest size, the largest population communities had a much higher growth in employment than the medium and smaller size. And the smaller the community gets, the lower the rate of change, the lower the rate of increase of employment. Okay. There's a fourth divide between, roughly speaking, cosmopolitan and local areas. So this is ethnic, or what the United States would be willing to call racial, or racial and ethnic if we want to be a little bit kind of fudge the meaning of those two things. So the short version of the story here, again, if you look across the 21st century, the share of urban whites, non-Hispanic whites, has declined quite precipitously. That's a big drop. It's declined also in suburban communities. Again, suburban communities are quite a wide range. It's barely dropped. It's dropped a little bit in rural communities, but much, much less. And so conversely, the share of the population who are foreign-born has increased. It's both higher in cities, and it has increased in cities at least proportional to that of suburbs, and perhaps more because you're starting from a slightly higher rate. The population loss is much greater in rural communities than it is in suburban, and much greater and somewhat greater in suburban than it is in urban. So again, you have a huge population shift, both decline in population in some communities more than in others, and a rise in the proportion foreign-born more likely in cities, and particularly a rise in the proportion of the population who are not non-Hispanic white. This is predominantly an increase in the share of Latinos or Hispanics. The black population has remained essentially the same, and the Asian population has also grown dramatically, but from a much lower base. So the share of whites in cities is declining. Most of the largest cities are no longer majority white, and that's a change, again, over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years. This is evidence. I hope you can see this. This slide's the images aren't quite as big as I would like them to be. This is from a survey that I did with colleague Ryan Enos. It's a national survey, about 1,800 participants. And what we did, there's a series of measures on the left-hand side. Some are individual measures, some are indices, in which we're trying to capture the idea of nativism or it's hard to, there's no sort of non-pejorative term. Nativism, xenophobia, America Firstism, whatever the right term would be. There's not all of them differ dramatically. You see the bottom three, essentially urban, suburban, and rural residents or respondents to this survey are pretty much the same. But if you look at the top four, the measure of racial resentment is a kind of a standard measure. It's a 4-item measure basically saying that African Americans don't deserve, they've gotten more than they deserve. They're not working hard enough. They're not, it's resentment of what's perceived to be excess benefits being provided to the African American population. Support, and you see much greater racial resentment among rural communities than in urban communities. Support for Trump's policies regarding immigration, you see a dramatic difference between rural communities and suburban and urban, on the other hand. The third measure is an index of groups that receive more in benefits than they contribute in taxes. And again, you see a greater opposition to or greater perception that blacks, Latinos, and illegal immigrants are getting more than they deserve in the rural population and in the urban, and so on. If you kind of go down these measures, the top four measures in particular, we're not quite prepared to say any one of these is precisely a measure of nativism, but if you look at the set of them in combination, there's a kind of a greater sense of resentment or anxiety about or perception of outsiders getting benefits that insiders are not getting, is consistently greater in rural communities than it is in urban communities. Okay, so I've got 4 or 5 measures. I could probably continue, but you kind of get the point here. And the issue here is that these measures are all lining up simultaneously, and they're all probably mutually causal in a way that I haven't quite been able to sort out. Partisan, economic, health, ethnic viewpoints are all dividing between urban and non-urban, in particular urban and rural or small town. Why do we care about this? I mean, now I'm going to kind of revert back to political science. Because, again, in a majoritarian political system, in a majoritarian democratic political system, there are often likely to be intense groups that don't particularly want to compromise. We call them single-issue groups. We call them Advocacy organizations, we call them passionate voters. We sometimes think that's a great thing if we're on their side, but collectively, this is a potentially destabilizing phenomenon for a majoritarian, large, complicated democratic political system. The solution is partly what I talked about before, kind of trust, connection, willingness to go negotiate. That's at the individual level. The more structural level, the way to put the same point, roughly speaking, is cross-cutting cleavages. So the idea here is, for example, there's two kind of classic examples. The New Deal, Northern and Southern Democrats were united on essentially class issues, on the idea of redistribution downward to try to get past the Depression and get the economy moving again. But Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans were joined on race issues. Southern Democrats were in opposition. There were no Southern Republicans in the 1930s. So you had kind of cross-cutting alliances depending on whether the issue was framed around questions of class or framed around questions of race. It made for a very complicated politics in the 1930s. And African Americans, poor, predominantly Southern black Americans, pretty much got left out of both class and racial dynamics, but it held the country together. This is the argument by Ira Katz-Nelson that in essentially throwing Southern blacks under the bus was the necessary condition for maintaining a, roughly speaking, majoritarian democratic political system during an era in which it was, of course, extremely dangerous politically for the United States and for lots of other countries. I don't need to tell you what happened in the 1930s. A more recent version of the same argument that sort of cross-cutting cleavages can hold a political system together, not always with desirable outcomes, but at least it keeps the system going, has to do with incarceration. In the 1960s, urban liberals who were not majority black, but who included African-American political leaders in the cities, joined with rural conservatives, both black and white, to support stringent drug laws in the United States. There was a tremendous fear of what was happening with regard to urban crime in particular, but maybe more generally crime. And so there's an alliance between, roughly speaking, left and right, black and white, around the necessity for more stringent laws for drug use in particular. That led to or at least was contributed substantially to the extraordinary rise in incarceration, particularly among young African-American men that we've seen in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years, way beyond the level of incarceration of any other country, except maybe Sierra Leone or something like that. I mean, I think that's the second country. I mean, it's quite amazing. And so what you see in the 2010s is a new kind of cross-cutting cleavage between libertarian Republicans, the Koch brothers, and essentially liberal, white, largely suburban Republicans, joining liberal Democrats. I said libertarian, not liberal. I meant to say libertarian, white, suburban politicians and their supporters, joining with liberal, predominantly urban, predominantly black Democrats in an effort to reduce incarceration. Their motivations are very different on the two sides, but again, it's a kind of a cross-cutting cleavage that is beginning to have an impact. The rise has stopped and may actually be slightly decreasing. What happens when you don't have these kind of cross-cutting cleavages around an issue that's as extraordinarily sensitive as incarceration or an era that's as extraordinarily difficult as the 1930s? The answer is 1860. And those of you who remember your American history will know, of course, that this is the moment at which the Civil War started. What does it look like to not have cross-cutting cleavages in a democratic political system? So this is the lead up to 1860. On the left-hand side, you have the two then major political parties in what was then the United States. And what you see, of course, is regional variation. The Purple Party, Whigs and Republicans, cut across the country, and there was no kind of clear regional distinction. 1860, what you see is an absolute distinction between the North and the South. That's the election that led to secession a few months later. So that's what happens when you don't have cross-cutting cleavages at the state level. Again, I'm mixing here parties, local areas, states, but the broad point is that a majoritarian, geographically based political system can get itself into real trouble if it doesn't have something that brings together groups that are otherwise fundamentally as separated as our urban and rural areas are now. So if geographic cleavages all line up, The old saw that all politics is local, which is, of course, an Americanism, probably less true in other countries, becomes a recipe for antagonism rather than a recipe for maintaining representative roots in the local community, which is originally what it was intended to mean. And representatives have very few electoral incentives to work against the further and further polarization of their local areas. If cosmopolitan and local areas are moving apart on these 4 or 5 dimensions, which are all reinforcing each other, the electoral incentives of a geographically based political representative is not to try to bring them together, not to try to create connection, cooperation, trust, not to try to create cross-cutting cleavages, because that's electorally dangerous. You can get out-primaried from either the left or the right, and you see representatives scurrying to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then when you add to that, now all of this precedes President Trump, but you add to it a political leader, a president, who does everything he possibly can, as far as I can tell, to reinforce these cleavages, it becomes much more dangerous. So this is President Trump's inaugural address. Their victories have not been yours. Their triumphs are not yours. While they celebrate, there was little to celebrate for struggling families across our land. This is the creation, the reinforcing, the promotion of a sense of a zero-sum competition rather than a collective enterprise in which we have differences, but somehow we can figure out how to work together. You see this in the political arena, in the current political context. So in the 2016 election, 60%, 3/5 of urbanites voted for the Democratic candidate, but the same proportion of rural residents voted for the Republican candidate. So again, you have a sort of electoral distinction in 2016, which translated more importantly in a structural sense into a huge difference in the party of the representatives. So rural and sparse suburban districts, 84% of those districts have Republican representatives. Urban and dense suburban districts, 90% have Democratic representatives. So once again, we see it's another version of the same claim, but we see fundamental, what I think are increasing differences between the urban and rural in a geographically based community, geographically based electoral system. There's no centripetal forces, there's lots of centrifugal forces. When does this kind of political polarization become a constitutional crisis? It isn't yet. Anything I've described so far isn't 1860. But it can become. 1860 did, of course, happen. So when I think there are several criteria for when we'd think that sort of a political polarization is tipping into a constitutional crisis. These aren't necessarily this is my list. One could play around with the kind of measures that we have here. But the inability to kind of keep the government functioning. We've obviously had the inability to pass a federal budget for a week, sometimes months, but the government has somehow managed to keep itself functioning more or less. That's a political crisis, it's not yet a constitutional crisis. If we get to the point where the government simply can't function, can't repel an invasion, can't pass a budget, can't pass absolutely essential legislation, that's a constitutional crisis. A direct confrontation between branches of government. We, of course, the United States is supposed to have a balanced 3-part system in which each branch is somewhat antagonistic, but also somewhat mutually reinforcing, blah, 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 blah. How broad and deep and consequential that confrontation has to be to move from a political to a constitutional crisis, I don't have a clear answer. We may be finding out over the next couple of months. Because we have a political system right now in which it looks like at least one branch of Congress and the presidency are directly at loggerheads and are going to be increasingly competitive. And so that, again, could tip us from a political competition into a constitutional crisis. One branch refuses to obey the laws, judicial decisions, constitutional provisions. We don't really have that yet. We have a lot of rhetoric about that, but we don't actually have flat-out disobedience of laws or judicial decisions. One branch uses the military. The military in the United States has been drawn into politics in a way over the last couple of years more than it had been before. But you don't see a military coup. You don't see anything like that. Elections are deemed illegitimate. Again, we have a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of concern about that. There is, on the part of some people, I think, an effort to reinforce the illegitimacy of elections. There's a lot of effort on the part of other people to kind of damp that kind of talk down, to reinforce legitimacy, so on. So I think we are not yet, as a country, in a constitutional crisis. But if you take these indicators, I think we're not too far away from it. Final point on this part of the argument, not only the United States, this is a Brexit map that probably everybody's seen a variant of. The short version of the story here is, of course, a huge regional divide between Leave and Remain. And if you look at the slightly more fine-grained, the dark bordered hexagons are the dense population, essentially London and a couple of other cities. So there's both a huge regional and a huge urban or cosmopolitan localist divide in support for Brexit in 2016. You could tell the same story in Turkey, you can tell the same story in Hungary, you could probably tell the same story in Germany, although I won't venture to do so in a room full of experts. So this is an American phenomenon, but I think it's not uniquely so. Okay, that's argument number one. I want to make argument number two much more briefly and with much less detail. And it has to do with a liberal constitutional crisis. Remember, I started by saying, not a big deal. Left and right are both a lot of hot air in 2016. It wasn't all that big a deal. But I have two caveats to the not such a big deal argument. One is the democratic political polarization, which might be tipping into constitutional crisis. I just talked about that. The second is essentially the possibility of a liberal political crisis, liberal constitutional crisis, by which I mean things, classic kind of 19th century understanding of liberal rights, autonomy, dignity, equality of persons, freedom of action. You can all generate the same list. I don't have anything dramatically new to say about that list. But the short version of the story is that liberalism is hard work. It requires politicians and the public. They don't actually have to believe in liberal values in a deep sense, but they have to act in the political public arena as though they believe in liberal values, liberal norms and commitments. Tolerance, forbearance, engagement, acceptance of others' rights, acceptance of the dignity of people with whom you profoundly disagree and you might find even fundamentally immoral or illegitimate. You got to act as though you believe in those things, even if in your heart of hearts you don't actually. So it's possible for a lot of members of the political system. Oh, thank you. Perfect. It's possible for a lot of members of the political system to not actually be very good liberals, and a liberal political system can chug along more or less effectively. What becomes dangerous, what becomes politically problematic, is when leaders themselves stop endorsing fundamental liberal values, rights, equality, dignity, autonomy, respect, so on. And when leaders undermine the protective institutions, the press, the representative system, free elections, free expression of ideas, independent judiciary. Again, there are sort of country variants of this. I'm mostly speaking out of the American context, but I think you could kind of easily plug in what you mean by institutions essential to a liberal political system, which again doesn't require that everybody actually believe in. It requires that people behave as though they believe in, and it requires that institutions that prop up liberal values are permitted to do their job. You will not be surprised to hear me say that I think both the liberal values and institutions are under attack. This is a wonderful article. The 500 people, places, and things that Donald Trump has insulted on Twitter, a complete list, since 2015. So if you actually look, if you go to the article and you go to the website, there's quotes attached to each one of these items on this. It's a long list. So all kinds of both, and these doesn't even include named individuals. I mean, if you added the particular individuals who have been insulted, the list goes down the page and halfway through the room. But categories of individuals whom you might think, in some sense, potentially highly vulnerable and who need the protection of liberal rights, autonomy, dignity, respect, kind of classic liberal rights. And in some ways, what worries me even more is a set of institutions and organizations that seem necessary to prop up a fundamentally liberal political system have been systematically, unsystematically undermined. Now, again, this is mostly, not entirely, but largely talk more than action. Not entirely, but the claim by the President of the United States to disvalue, scorn, denigrate, make fun of, insult groups of individuals or institutions that seem necessary to a liberal political system is not itself a constitutional crisis, but it kind of edges us in that direction. I want to quickly point out that this is not unique to President Trump. There's the famous basket of deplorables quote from Hillary Clinton. She did it a lot less than he did and does, but it's a pretty powerful sentence. You could put half of Trump supporters into the basket of deplorables, racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. That's a pretty non-liberal statement. And she apparently got off the stage after she said that, and she said, well, I just lost the presidency. I mean, she knew that this was a really bad thing to have said. The picture on the left is from Representative Rashida Tlaib. And I don't know if you can read it. It says, impeach the fucker, vote for Rashida. So, you know, the left has its share of, shall we say, illiberal, leaderly cues. Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Senator Graham, President Trump, if you remember, called for Representative Ilhan Omar, Tlaib, and two others, the people, the Gang of Four, the sort of the four left, young, non-Anglo representatives recently elected, to go back to their home countries. Three of them were, in fact, born in the United States. The fourth is an American citizen from Somalia. I don't think it's racist to say that. He says, I don't think a Somali refugee who embraced Trump would be asked to go back. If you're racist, you want everybody to go back because they're black or Muslim. Now, of course, we do have a ban on countries whose members are almost entirely Muslim, so Graham is not being altogether consistent with himself, but set that aside. But that's not what this is about. If you embrace Trump's policies, it doesn't matter where you come from, he probably likes you. So there's a kind of rejection of the assertion from what I think is a pretty clear liberal perspective that go back to your home country and get out of the United States is an illiberal statement. So I wanted to say that this is not unique to Trump. It's not even unique to Republicans, although I do think there's a disproportionality in the attack on liberal values. Are there any consequences other than a lot of talk and ban against Muslims and various other people? Well, yes. This is an indicator of hate crimes. It only goes to 2017 from the FBI. The big spike on the left side, of course, is 2001. And so there was a huge spike of particularly anti-Muslim hate crimes between September and December of 2001, enough to make that spike. But then it went back down pretty quickly. It declined pretty consistently. Starting in 2014, so again, before the election, the number of hate crimes based on race, religion, or sexuality, this is the compendium of all of what the FBI defines as hate crimes, has been pretty consistently rising. I would like very much to see 2018 data, but they're not yet presented. So there's a real consequence of the kind of increasing antagonism and anger in the United States. Another version of the same thing is declining confidence in government. Now, again, this is a very long trend. It's not recent. It doesn't have to do in particular with the 2016. And in fact, it continues to decline during the Obama era. So it's not like a good lefty Democratic president can somehow reverse these phenomena. I'm not sure that declining significance in government is necessarily a bad thing. If I were African American in the 1950s, and you asked me to be confident in the government, I would say go jump in a lake. So it's not obvious that confidence in government is intrinsically necessary for successful liberal polity. But when you get down into the sort of the 10s and 15 level, it's pretty difficult for public officials to make the case that government can in fact be a constructive force in maintaining a liberal polity. Loss of local newspapers, another variant on the same thing. The red dots are there's no local newspaper. The yellow dots are that there's only one local newspaper. So if we think a free press, the exchange of ideas, the marketplace of ideas in which truth will out, and so on and so forth, again, a kind of classic liberal value, it's very difficult if you think newspapers are a core part of that exchange of ideas. Now, this map doesn't, of course, map onto the increase in social media, so maybe there's a substitute, but if we think kind of traditional press is an important part of liberalism, maintenance of liberal values, then the United States is in some trouble. More generally, the proportion of Americans with a great deal of confidence in the press has been declining significantly since the 1970s. It started at about 80%, no partisan difference. By 2018, only less than 20%, fewer than 20% of Republicans have a great deal or even some confidence in the press. So again, if we think of the press as an essential institution for maintaining liberal values, there's reason to be concerned. The other thing one more that I want to talk about from our own survey, these are measures of racism. My colleague Ryan Enos wanted to put these 10 items on our survey, and I thought it was a big waste of time because, so, you know, there's no point in putting an item on a survey if everybody agrees with it or disagrees with it, right? And I was sure there wasn't going to be any variation. He was, of course, right, and I was totally wrong. So what this is a series of questions about, do you think the following statement is or is not racist? And what you see is a great deal of variation. For current purposes, ignore them two middle bars. Just look at the red bar on the always on the right-hand side, the red dots, and the purple dots always on the left-hand side. The red dots are people who voted for President Trump and continued to support him 2 years later when we did a follow-up survey. The purple dots are people who did not vote for President Trump and who continued to oppose him in the 2-year follow-up survey. And what you see is a quite considerable difference in what people understand to be racism. Nobody, or very few people at least, want to be identified as being racist. But what counts as racism is fundamentally different for Trump supporters than for Trump opponents. So, not surprisingly, voting for Donald Trump, Trump supporters do not see as being racist. Many Trump opponents do. The zero line is essentially neutral, neither racist nor not racist. I don't know, I'm somewhere in the middle, I don't have an opinion kind of position. Wanting to maintain the Confederate flag. Trump supporters are not so sure, but they're certainly very different from Trump opponents. So the idea that the Confederate flag is or is not a racist phenomenon, and perception, is or is not support for racism, is itself fundamentally under political contestation. As you can get down the kind of the list and you see most of the same thing, saying immigrants commit too many crimes. Trump supporters say that's not racist or not nativist. Trump opponents say that it is. Saying that people in America should speak English. Trump supporters say that's not racist. Trump opponents say that it is, and so on. You can work your way down on every single question. Sometimes the differences are much greater than at other times, but in every single item, Trump supporters are less likely to say that whatever we asked is racist than Trump opponents are. Just to tie the two halves of my talk together, there's a similar phenomenon, although less dramatically different, for urban, suburban, and rural. In each case, rural residents, where there is a difference, in each case, rural residents are less likely to say that the statement is racist. Urban residents are always more likely to say that the statement is racist, although in some of them there's very little difference. Okay, so what I want to say is that there is a threat to liberal values analogous to the threat to democratic values. I don't want to say that the United States is a fundamentally illiberal country at this point. I don't want to say that liberalism has died. I don't want to say that the guardrails of liberal norms that my colleagues Ziblatt and Levitsky talk about, the guardrails have been broken. But I want to say that we're kind of edging in that direction. And there's a fair amount of both public opinion evidence and I think more institutional, organizational evidence that the things we tend to think of as essential to maintain the very difficult norm and practice of liberal values is under threat. So, what's next? I have 3 concluding statements and then I'll stop. The first is relax, and the latter 2 are don't relax, roughly speaking. So the relax is, again, back to another variant on the populism is not so dangerous except for people like me and maybe some of the rest of us in this room who are a little scared of it. C. Vann Woodward, who's about as great an authority on American history and American politics as you can possibly get, one must expect and hope that there will be future upheavals to shock the seats of power and privilege, furnish the periodic therapy that's necessary to the health of our democracy. I was astonished when I saw this from Woodward. It's not what I think of C. Vann Woodward as saying, but there it is in print. And if it's good enough for him, it's probably good enough for the rest of us. A more contemporary version of that is a book recently published by Jack Balkin, who is a constitutional law scholar at Yale University, one of the probably IQ smart, higher than at least the left half of this room. He's just an extraordinary scholar. And he and Sandy Levinson wrote a book that's essentially a dialogue, letters between the two of them, in which Levinson argues that we are in a constitutional crisis and Balkin says that we're not. And he has a list of his own, which actually my own list is partly derived from. We're not currently in a constitutional crisis, writes Balkin. which he defines as a danger that the Constitution is about to fail at its central task of keeping disagreement within the bounds of ordinary politics, rather than breaking into anarchy, violence, or civil war. And his criteria for a constitutional crisis, you see there, politicians announce that they will not obey the Constitution. Again, President Trump has kind of flirted with the idea, well, what about a third term as president? Well, I'm not sure that I'd accept the results of the election. But he hasn't actually done that, flirting around the edges. The Constitution keeps political actors from preventing a looming disaster. That has not yet happened. We could imagine ways, depends on whether you think climate change is looming or distant. But we are not yet at a moment where the American political system simply cannot function in the face of an impending and immediate disaster. People disagree so strongly that they engage in violence. Again, we've had a little bit of that, Charlottesville, of course, but we don't have wholesale violence in the streets. So Balkan's argument is that we have a lot of indicators that we could be moving in the direction, but we're not actually in a constitutional crisis, certainly compared with other countries around the world which have had genuine and absolutely severe constitutional crises. So that's one conclusion, is just relax. The second conclusion, which doesn't quite have the same tenor, is beware false nostalgia. Actually, has there ever been a moment where the United States was a robustly liberal, democratic, constitutional polity? Well, no. Before the 1860s, if you ignore more than half of the population, the answer is yes, but if you include more than half of the population, the answer is no. If you ignore the genocide against the Native Americans, it's a little, et cetera, et cetera. So before the 1860s, it's hard to make the case. The Gilded Age, the late 19th century, well, no. The 1920s, well, no. The era of McCarthyism in the 1950s, well, no. So it's not like we have a good old days that we should look back to as having been an era of robust, democratic, liberal, constitutional success. We certainly had better economic times. We've had better political times. But it's not like there's some golden era in the past that we're trying to get back to. We never have. And this is, of course, a picture of the Klan in the 1920s in front of the American Capitol. So the second conclusion is the president's policies dismay people like me. That's not the evidence that we now face a constitutional crisis. And I think what I've been trying to do through this whole talk is distinguish between what I consider to be a deeply dangerous political moment and a genuine constitutional crisis. We should permit, maybe even encourage, some degree of separation there. However, my final point is beware, on the other hand, false sense of security. Maybe we've never had a fully functioning constitutional era, but nonetheless, I think there are danger signs that we need to take very seriously. We did have a normal election. We are, in the United States, at relative peace. We do have a growing economy. There are problems with the economy, but it's nonetheless growing. We do have fundamental, most of the time, adherence to law. Nonetheless, all of this can be undermined by a very talented demagogue, a very angry and fearful citizenry, incompetent and offensive institutions, geographically based majoritarian first-past-the-post electoral districts which can't compensate for zero-sum games, a self-regarding elite, the temptations of racism, nativism, those are all very dangerous. And so the final quotation that I want to leave you with, Stephen Bannon, who was a White House aide, I guess, no longer in the White House, but circling around fairly closely within the Trump administration, gave a speech to Alabama. I don't know if anybody here knows who Roy Moore was. He was running for the Senate. He's a Republican, running for the Senate in Alabama. This was a couple years ago. And he was credibly accused, although at that point I believe had not been convicted, of pedophilia in malls, basically, sort of going after young teenage girls in malls. So, and there's a bunch of other stuff. He was not exactly an upstanding character, let's put it that way. But he was a Democrat, he was a Republican candidate. Bannon endorsed him. Trump campaigned for him and so on. And Steve Bannon said at a campaign rally, Alabamians should vote for Roy Moore for Senate because if they can destroy Roy Moore, they can destroy you. And what caught my attention was not the Roy Moore piece of it, but the word destroy. That's a really powerful term in a Democratic election for, one senator, off-election cycle for the state of Alabama. Destroy is a really powerful word. And if that's what people think one election is about, then that's pretty dangerous. And in fact, liberal democracies can fall apart, and if people think that the people whom they oppose in a vote are about to destroy them, that's a pretty bad signal. So far so good, but no, I'm not taking any bets for the future. And I'll stop there. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We have time for some questions, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. So let's open up. Johannes.
Thanks a lot for your talk. My name is Johannes Leitgeb. I'm a researcher here. So I found your talk and all the different data that you presented very fascinating. Thanks a lot for that very detailed look at the different cleavages in society. I was wondering, in the relaxed part at the end of your presentation, and also in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about, civil war, violence in the streets, and it seems to me like, isn't this a really, really low bar? That we should not have a civil war. That's true, but I guess there's other political outcomes, just like if it's, for example, just gridlock. We can't get the different branches of government to agree on something. We can just continue with the status quo, even there are new problems arising, and we can't respond to that. This doesn't lead to immediate violence in the street, but this is also, I guess that you could call that a constitutional crisis too. I don't know.
It's a good question, and I mean, as you might guess, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out where to place the bar for this. I have two reasons for, I don't know whether I'd call it a high or a low bar, of saying constitutional crisis requires something close to government immobility, something close to widespread violence in the streets, something close to flat-out rejection of the constitutional rules, something close to bringing the military. I don't want to quite go that far, but you're right. I have a pretty high threshold for what I would count. I think for two reasons. One is, well, three reasons. One is that, I mean, again, if you look at American history, we've stumbled through, with the exception of 1860 to 1865, which is not a trivial exception, we've stumbled through a lot of really bad political stuff. I mean, we have had riots in the streets. We have had large majorities of the population simply totally disfranchised and kept out of the electoral system. We have had, something close to government shutdowns, and yet we would still, again, with the exception of 1860, call ourselves a constitutional government. So I look at history as a slightly reassuring, again, with this huge exception. I don't know how to think about that exception because it's, it's the elephant in the middle of the room. So that's point number one, is that since we've never had a really well-functioning constitutional system, political system, it's not clear to me that we're any worse now than we have been. That's the short version of that, again, with the exception. The second reason is that I'm very worried about the roughly 40% of the American population who looks at this whole political era really differently from me and from my 40%, right? So and somehow if I'm right that the country has to figure out, the two sides have to figure out how to get past the increasing zero-sum phenomenon and move toward talking to each other, the more the left says this is an absolute crisis, tragedy, destruction of everything we love and cherish about our country, the more the right says, in effect, go jump in a lake. You live in a totally different world from me. And so it's an effort to try to ratchet the rhetoric on the left down a little in the hopes that the rhetoric on the right can be ratcheted down and there can be some move toward at least engagement. The more, yeah, okay. And then I guess the third reason, and it really comes out of the Balkan book and my colleagues Levitsky and Ziblatt, is that the United States looks relatively stable compared to other countries which really have lost their liberal democratic constitutional structure and moved into a military dictatorship or something like that. So comparative across countries, we're not in such dire straits. Compared to our history, we're probably no worse than we have been for most of American history. Compared to other people who think that actually this is the right move for the country, I want to kind of ratchet the rhetoric down.
A question from Michael.
Thank you very much for this firework of interesting points and data. I just have a question. I mean, the translation of this urban-rural divide into a constitutional crisis, to which extent does it depend on a majoritarian voting system?
Does it depend on what?
Majoritarian voting system as opposed to a proportional voting system. So, I mean, the second case that you showed is UK, and there you have, of course, also a district majoritarian voting system as opposed to a proportional voting system. If it plays a role, then, of course, the question arises, why is it now that this may translate into a constitutional crisis, into those two political systems which have proved least vulnerable to crisis in their history?
Yeah. Good questions. If I had answers, I probably would have said them already. I think proportional PR systems just have a different kind of political dynamic, right? There's likely to be more than two parties, for one thing. And so the nature of the political negotiation there is between 3, 4, if you're in Israel, 17, I mean, some very large number of parties. So it's not like they can't have constitutional crises when you have huge divides between urban and rural, or between cosmopolitan and localist. It's not quite a geographic, the metaphor but it's a different dynamic, a different kind of constitutional dynamic. What I'm especially worried about in the American context, and again, I think the British is somewhat similar, is that once you have a profoundly geographically based electoral system, an only geographically based electoral system, and you have all these divides lining up simultaneously, so that partisan and health and economy and ethnicity, demography and values, and I could have added religion, all the electoral incentives for a representative of that particular district are only to represent the center of that district. There's absolutely no incentive to move toward the center of the country, if there is such a thing. And that's especially, and I can't see anything in the constitutional system that works against that centrifugal force, with the possible exception of our president. And that's why the president is so important. That's the one centripetal elected office in the United States. And if you have a centripetal force, i.e. a president, who's doing everything he possibly can to reinforce the centrifugal quality of the system, then there's no countervailing pressure to bring it back together, except, members of Congress who are willing to risk their election. And we don't have a lot of those. And it's not clear that I or you or anybody else, it's easy to blame them, but it's probably not. So I think that a PR system could easily have the same kinds of national dynamics and the same kinds of growth of polarization and a sense of zero sum, and we know that that's happened. But the nature of the electoral structure of trying to cope with that is going to be more about coalitional politics and more about sort of small parties having an outsized say, whereas in the United States, small parties just get shut out. I think you had a second question. I'm not sure that I answered. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for a fantastic talk. And I think you've covered just about everything, except for how do we get beyond this? I mean, I found this profoundly depressing, but as well as impressive. So I wonder, do we focus on the sources? So is this about the economics, redistribution, better services, working on inequality? Although, who does this with Trump in power is the question. Is it sociocultural? How do we mend the divide then? How do you deal with migration issues in a way that gets us beyond the Republican-Democrat divide? What about political? You've just answered the proportional representation question, but can we switch to proportional representation? I doubt it. So does the deep state, quote unquote, solve our problems, sort of the institutions? And what about leadership? Is there any chance, sort of a new leadership, someone who can bridge the divide in the political discourse? Or do we have to wait for bottom-up social movements? But God knows they
Yeah,
could be the
right.
scary kind.
Well, you've just given us pretty much the list of the things that I mean, you know, over dinner, we should work our way down your list and kind of think our way through them. I think that I have a couple of answers, some of which you've already suggested. One is in the long run, demography is going to rescue us, right? I mean, sort of people under age 30, maybe age 40, depending on how you want to think about the divide, live in a different country. I mean, some important part of this story is kind of racial fear. And I didn't want to emphasize that because I think it's the easiest go-to for the left. The problem is those white folk don't like black folk. And I'm not sure that that's wrong. That's why I showed these racism evidence. But it feels to me that's the easiest, in some sense, most superficial, although also very deep answer for the left. So I don't want to kind of go there in any simple sense. Nonetheless, people age, you know, I don't know, under age 40, live in a really different world than those of us who published books 40 years ago. You know, they live in a world where there are just lots of people who don't look like them, whose native language is different. Now, again, this is mostly a urban and coastal and southeast, southwestern phenomenon. It's not the entire country. So, and they are somewhat, you know, a segment of them grew up with Obama as president, and the world didn't come to an end, right? I mean, their first political image was a black man sitting at the desk and all these white guys standing around behind him looking respectfully down while he was signing a law, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody else has that mental image, but it's an extremely powerful image. So if we could just hang on for another 10 or 20 years, that set of the population is going to be moving into the much greater likelihood of voting. Now, they will become more conservative than they are now because people, in general, cohorts become more conservative. But, so that's part of the answer. But I think that we're at a maximally threatening demographic moment, I guess is one way to put it. I can't think of any country, and I'd be curious if anybody else, in which the majority population, I'm white here, non-Hispanic white, has in effect allowed itself to become a minority population peacefully. I mean, we all know what those demographic projections look like. The Census Bureau has been putting them out for a decade. If we think about Hispanics as being non-white, non-Anglo, which is a huge question in itself we could talk about later, whites are going to be a minority of the population 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. That's extraordinary. I mean, they will, in effect, have peacefully permitted themselves to become a minority segment of the population. I can't think of any other country where that's ever happened. Now, probably Hispanics will, in effect, become white, and so what I'm describing won't... So demography is part of the answer. It's part of the problem right now, but I also think it's part of the solution. A second, it's a slightly shorter and more focused answer. There's a lot of people talking about ranked voting. So you vote for your first, second, third choice. And if, in fact, that gets institutional, that's a somewhat smaller institutional fix than shifting entirely to a PR system, which I don't think we're ever going to do. We're not going to get rid of the Senate. One could think about that and so on. But ranked voting you could do relatively easily. And so if you have a second and third choice, the expectation among the electoral scholars, so correct me if I'm wrong here, is that everybody would vote for their favorite candidate first, which is going to be a sort of a identitarian or ideological choice. And then they're going to vote, it's going to move more toward this. There's going to be an incentive for candidates to be your second and third choice. And so that will be a set of candidates who will be more centrist. Everybody can tolerate them as a second choice, even if they aren't really your first choice. So there'll be a cohort of candidates. There's a logic to the ranked voting that suggests a movement toward more negotiation, more centrism, something like that. 2018, I mean, you know, we had essentially a peaceful election in which the Democrats won the House. Right? So one answer is, I mean, this is Dave Mayhew's argument, that elections are an enormous shock absorber. We anticipate, this is back to the low threshold question, we anticipate a essentially peaceful and sane and successful 2020 election. You know, around the edges, voter disfranchisement and so on, but fundamentally we think there's going to be an election, we think there's going to be an outcome that's identifiable, we think the winners are going to win and the losers are going to leave, right? So, you know, in that sense, the system sort of kind of works. There's some argument that the biggest newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, have actually been more successful since being attacked as fake news. They've actually grown in strength and robustness and engagement and readership. So, you know, we're losing small-town newspapers, but we seem to be retaining the biggest. There is a lot of social movement. I mean, there's lots of, you know, Theda Skocpol talks about, you know, all this sort of suburban women, liberal Republicans or conservative Democrats, who are disgusted with the kind of the grossness of the political scene out there, and they're moving into electoral politics. Because this is not what the country that they want their kids to grow up in. And so they're going to fix it. How big that is, how robust, how important, unclear. So.
I'm going to abuse my position and ask a question, and then we have some more. But alongside, you know, this polarization, we're also seeing in the left, the primaries now, the rise of social democratic platforms, sort of a stronger, what would previously be seen as very radical positions, becoming positions of leading candidates and so on. So can this serve the role of eventually serve an equivalent role to a cross-cutting cleavage? Is this a response to this?
I have no idea the answer to that. It's a great question. I have to say, I mean, a parochial American, right? I remember, I mean, some years ago, I think college or graduate school, I was on a trip in Europe, and we met with the mayor of Budapest, and he said, well, you know, as a socialist, I think such and such is... And I just remember thinking, oh, my God, you know, no mayor that I'd ever thought, you know, no American mayor would say, as a socialist, I think such and such. Well, so Bernie Sanders now uses the S word, right? And the country hasn't fallen apart. So there is a wider willingness to engage, I think, than there had been over the last 30 or 40 years. You know, I go back and forth on this question. I'm actually very curious what you or Margaret or Charles or other people think. Sometimes I think that we need to develop a much more robust left as a genuine alternative. Polarization of the type I'm describing is bad, but clearly distinct political, ideological, normative policy frameworks that are clearly different from each other is not bad. I mean, that's good, right? Because we actually have choices, and that's what elections are supposed to be about. So how to... I'm evading an answer to your question because I'm not sure what the answer is. I think how to develop a genuinely social democratic left alternative which takes inequality front and center seriously, which doesn't jettison questions of race, gender, sexuality, and so on, but puts class at the center, as compared with a genuine conservative right, which puts individual liberty or small government or whatever market forces at its center. That seems to me entirely desirable. How to get from here to there is not clear to me, because it seems to me we have a moment at which vituperation is so great on both sides, more from the right to the left, but maybe the people on the right would say the opposite. How to get to clear, distinct political and policy positions and away from anger, frustration, fury, delegitimation. I don't know.
So we're open to answers to that question. In the meantime...
That was an evasion of an answer.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Oh, please.
We will get an answer to this question.
All right. I don't know if everybody heard it. Margaret says she's going to address the question that I didn't quite answer in her talk. All right. So, hang on.
Thanks. Inge Fenske from the University of Amsterdam. So I thought all of your talk was incredibly enriching. I did wonder at the same time whether there may be a bit of a disconnect between the first part of it on all the work that is going on the ground and all the different divides, economic, geographic, ethnic, and so on and so forth. And then on the other hand, the later part where you emphasize and discuss the threshold for and the existence of a constitutional crisis, which really places emphasis on overt violence, on moments of this kind of overt, tangible political crisis. So I'm at home in international law, and there's a great text in our discipline by a feminist international lawyer, Hilary Charlesworth, a discipline in crisis. So as international lawyer, we're dealing with crisis all the time, from one crisis to the other. And she criticizes that emphasis on all these crises in international law where the law is rejected outright all the time, saying that this takes the emphasis away from all the structural violence that happens on the ground all the time, and she proposes an approach of international life, international law, everyday life, international law approach on the other hand, which would connect to the first part of your talk. So I was wondering if that speaks to you, or if you see that divide as well.
Trying to think how to answer. What I was trying, the way I saw the two halves of the talk, well, one was sort of the democratic question of cosmopolitan local and the dangers to a geographic first past the post system. And then the second part, I was trying to focus on kind of liberalism, liberal norms and values, respect, autonomy, dignity. And what I wanted to say is that both of those are endangered. We're not quite at a crisis stage in either one, but both are endangered. They obviously are mutually reinforcing, although I treated them as two separate phenomena. And that we need liberal behaviors, even if not everybody believing liberal norms, and we need the capacity for the polarized geographic areas to figure out some way to talk to each other. So I'm not sure, so I wasn't trying to emphasize averting crisis in the second part of the talk as much as I was trying to emphasize, reinforce, promote, create, if necessary, liberal norms and practices. So I think that, it seems to me there is underlying structural violence. I wouldn't disagree with that. I guess I'm enough of a Whig-ish historian to think that it's probably a lot less now than it has been at almost any earlier point in American history. So I actually want to, on that dimension, I think I'd want to emphasize the positive in the sense of saying, look, we do know how to improve, how to move away from fundamental racial hierarchy, fundamental gender hierarchy, fundamental sexual hierarchy. And we've gotten pretty good at that, at least compared to our own past. I'm not sure this is really an answer. I'm kind of thinking my thing. So without wanting to deny the fact of structural violence, both within countries and across countries, what I want to emphasize is both the importance and necessity and to a considerable degree success of liberal norms that cut against the kind of structural violence that I think you're talking about. I'm not sure that's a full answer, but as close as I can come at the moment.
Good.
I'm Arkady Putilov, live here in Berlin. Thank you for your brilliant talk. And there was a term classes in the title. Recollecting classes of the time of Karl Marx. Can you name the classes in the today's states?
Yeah, class is probably a somewhat misleading term. I probably should have said something like inequality or, yeah. So I clearly was not using class in any strong structural Marxist sense. You're absolutely right. And in that sense, it was a little bit of wasn't an intentional bait and switch, but it was a little bit misleading. I think what I keep referring to Raj Chetty's work, in part because I'm so influenced, and in part because we've heard about it. I think what I'm trying to get at here with the word class was the notion of opportunity, mobility, the kind of the death of despair logic, which I put into the category of health. Social strata, but as much a sense of possibility as current existing social economic location. What feels to me dangerous about the divide that I keep coming back to is the sense that there's no dynamism in at least a large part of the rural, sparse suburban segment of the country. That's why the venture capital bit of data. You could talk about it, but sort of the growth of jobs in the large cities as compared to smaller areas. So class isn't quite the right word, because I'm not talking about a kind of a deep structural built-in economic dynamic in a strong Marxist sense, or even a slightly weaker Marxist sense. It's more, maybe it's what Raj is talking about in terms of kind of his understanding of the American dream. We've got other data from the survey that I didn't show. Sort of Trump supporters feel like they're not going anywhere. They haven't done any better than their parents. Their kids are not going to do any better. They endorse Trump's treatment of the economy as a whole, but they feel stuck. And they feel like they're going to be stuck and their kids are going to be stuck. Trump opponents don't feel like that. They feel pretty successful, and they feel like their kids are going to be pretty successful, and they have been upwardly mobile from their parents. So I could have showed those data, but I was trying to not show too much. So it's economic strata, but it's more trajectory than it is circumstance, is what I'm really trying to get at here. And my shorthand word was class, which is probably a little misleading.
So there's a puzzle there that goes back also to your earlier work. So Jennifer has written in part on the way researchers are split in some thinking very much in terms of identity-based arguments and some thinking much more in terms of material structure-based arguments. And behind the class question is we often analyze in terms of strata, whereas class, going back to Marx, also has an identity component to it. Right? Now, you might think, this is from your earlier work, you might think that this limitations on social mobility are beneficial for the generation of class identities. Right? So you had an earlier argument that the fact that people are expecting they can move up, this belief of social mobility is one thing that can prevent people thinking in class lines. Is there an argument that this limitation on social mobility could help generate class identities, or why not?
In principle, but I sure don't see it in the United States. I mean, I don't see any evidence of that happening. From my earlier work, Americans just don't think in class structural terms. There's not very much class identity, as you know, as we all know. If I think about the localists, the discouraged, non-mobile localists, I don't think the simple racism story is adequate. I don't think the simple religion and guns story is adequate. What's the matter with Kansas? Well, they're all focused on cultural. There's elements of that, but I don't think it's adequate. I think it's, the person they voted for, again, this is a little stereotyped, is a self-proclaimed billionaire. We'll find out if his taxes get revealed whether he actually is a billionaire, but that's not a class identity. That's either I want to be like him, or I want to fantasize that my kids could be like him, or I admire, my kids aren't going to be rich. None of us are going to be rich. But I admire success. I admire wealth. I admire the wealthy person. That doesn't generate a class identity of the kind of conventional. One very just quick anecdote about that. Many years ago in the What's Fair book, I interviewed wealthy Americans and poor Americans and asked exactly the question that you referred to. Why don't the poor want redistribution of wealth? And so I spent 6 hours asking them some variant of that question that people could actually intelligibly think about. Not 6 hours at a stretch, over a period of several days. And one woman, I just remember this quote, she's commented, very smart, very sensitive. She knew exactly where her position was in the class structure. She knew that it wasn't always her fault. This was not false consciousness. She said, Nelson Rockefeller, age me more than anything else I'm about to say. Nelson Rockefeller wants to leave his house to his kids. I want to leave my house to my kids. It's the same thing. It's just his house is bigger. Well, yeah. So I think that's a fairly common American sentiment. Donald Trump knows how to make money. I sure wish I knew how to make money. Doesn't generate class politics of a traditional.
Okay. Sorry, it's two smaller questions. So I guess the first one is just on the cosmopolitan versus local, kind of as what you've been talking.
Slow down. Just say it again.
And cosmopolitan versus local, kind of this discussion that you're having. And I guess from my sense, these terms, I think about people who live in cities, and I don't know if you have data that speak to this, but often the people who live in cities are not from that city. They're often from other areas of the U.S. And so I wonder if you were to, you talk about VC investment and kind of a certain, very small proportion of these large cities, if you were to increase economic growth and economic opportunities, kind of going to the economic opportunities argument in the smaller cities, do you think this would reverse kind of in some ways the geographic divisions that you see, and just kind of in some ways sending back all the people my age, more or less, who went to cities? Right. And I'm thinking in my generation of people who actually have moved to these other states, pretty much all of my friends that I know and most people that I know in cities, there's only a certain subset of areas in the US where you can find a job, right? So if you were to increase job creation in other areas, then perhaps you would change electoral composition. I don't know if that's something that you have any data or thoughts on. And the second is on cross-cutting cleavages. Maybe the reverse of the socialist in some ways is Pete Buttigieg, who's not quite socialist, but is a very interesting case. I wonder what you think about him, just in terms of him appealing both to the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah, great questions. The economic opportunities of moving to smaller locations, I think there is some work trying to go exactly in that direction. I think a larger version of that question, I'll get back to the particular question in a minute. In the 1970s, everybody was writing about the decline of cities, right? Cities were in terrible shape. They were going bankrupt, crime was extraordinarily high, there was no interesting stuff going on. Everything interesting was going on out in the suburbs, or maybe the smaller towns, or people were moving to the south or moving to the west, and the northeast was the Rust Belt. It was dying, right? So there is some big historical, I don't know if it's cyclicality necessarily, but there's some big historical phenomenon going on in which we reversed, in the 1910s and maybe 20s, we reversed whatever the dynamic was in which cities were going down, now cities are up. Whether that, in fact, is cyclical, and 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to be writing again about the decline of the cities and what's the matter, why is it that nobody wants to move into these horrible, desolate places, I think in some ways underlies, or at least I think of that when I think of your question. There is some work, Brookings Institution in particular, but various other places are working seriously on revitalizing towns and communities. There seems to be, it's like school reform, right? There are lots of individual cases of success, and nothing that I can see that's structural and systematic and that moves across particular cases. I spent years studying school reform, and I gave up because it just was so discouraging. I couldn't find anything that changed more than particular schools. So you can find lots of good instances of innovation and renovation of particular locations. I haven't seen anything that moves across lots of locations. I think the two things that might do that, one thing that might do that, one is that sort of whatever happened in the 70s, we need to go back and look at that history more carefully about how cities went up. But there is a lot of work on sort of the increasingly cost in cities. It's just very expensive to live in the biggest and most cosmopolitan locations. And so people are commuting now an hour or 2 hours, and so young adults who want a life rather than a commute, or who have children, or who want to establish themselves, there's some evidence that they're actually moving away from the most robust, most exciting, most expensive, least housing available cities into at least smaller cities. So they're moving to Seattle. Now that's not quite a cosmopolitan move. It's not a move from cosmopolitan to local. I quickly hasten to assure you. But it's not just, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. So I think housing costs will partly equilibrate. And there are lots of good examples, none of which, as far as I can tell, have accumulated yet. Buttigieg, he seems to me, he's too young at the moment. He's not gonna, not that he's too young, but he's too young for the country. I think even Obama was a decade older, right? So I think there is, this is the opposite of the question about social democracy and the clear political distinction. There is, I think, room for, if not a sort of a simple centrist. So this is one last comment and then I'll stop. So Jack Balkin's other argument about whether there is or is, so one argument is whether there is or is not a constitutional crisis. His other argument is that we're on the cusp of a, political realignment, right? That over the next decade or two, maybe, we're going to realign the way in which we do politics. The old Democratic Party is kind of falling apart. The old Republican Party has already fallen apart. And people like Buttigieg might be at the edge of formulating some new way of thinking about either reinventing political centrism or reconfiguring the lines of contradiction. So I think that's a real possibility, but I have nothing very concrete to say about exactly what that would look like. I don't think he does either, frankly, but he might.
Good. So I had two jobs. One was to keep us on time, and I failed at that one. But we can continue the conversation outside. The second is to thank you so much for a wonderful and stimulating talk.
Thank you.
Get us going.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Oh, how beautiful. Ooh. Thank Thank you. That was lovely.